Blue Ridge PBS Echo is pleased to partner with Virtual Virginia and VSTE, the Virginia Society for Technology in Education, to share recordings of the VIBE Professional Development webinars. VIBE stands for Virginia is into Blended Education, and these workshops are delivered via the Virtual Virginia Professional Learning Platform. If you'd like to learn more, contact your division technology leaders to find out how to enroll in courses that delve deeper into the principles contained in these videos.
I think it's important to first start with really a common understanding of what is blended learning, just so that as we're talking and having these discussions, we're all at the same point with how we're moving forward. And then it's also important to compare blended learning to what is a tech enriched environment, because they are different and sometimes they can be confused. And then we're also going to look at two different rotation models for blended learning, the flipped classroom and also station rotation. And then finally, we're just going to take a quick talk about some considerations that you might consider if you're looking at instituting flipped or station rotation lessons in your classroom.
Okay, great. So let's get on with this. And the first one is the blended learning, just kind of coming to that, that common understanding of what that is. So if you can give us your perspective on defining that and the elements thereof, go ahead.
Sure. So when you think about blended learning, really what you want to consider is that you have both an online aspect where students are learning partly through online resources. But with the online portion, they are in control of their path and pace. So what that does is give students some degree of agency, and that is a piece that is essential when you're talking about blended learning, giving students that control or that agency over how they're learning. But obviously it's blended, so it's not just online. There's also an in-person component. And so you still have that face-to-face connection and instruction with a teacher. But what's important here is that you bring them together. And like I have this little image here with like that jar salad, but everything, it all mixes together, but it's all sort of layered. So you've got this online and in-person instruction, but they're not necessarily duplicates of each other. So you wouldn't start with online learning and then come in and have students repeat the same learning with you face-to-face. It's really always moving forward. So whatever you're giving students for resources and their online experience, you are just taking that and moving them to the next level when they are in person with you. Except for when you might need to do some remediation or provide some additional support, but it's constant moving forward in what you're providing with students.
Great, thanks for that kind of overview. So this tech-enriched learning compared to blended learning, and I know that you wanted to really kind of get into like what are some of the differences, what are some of the places where there might be overlap. So talk a little bit about that, please, Anne.
Well, I think this is what we are so accustomed to with what we've been doing recently, even in the past, decade or 2 decades or more, depending on where you are and where your county is with their integration. I think of tech enriched learning as more of like traditional learning with some spice. So you're using technology to complete the assignments, but everything is still at the same pace and place and time. We're all working on a Google Doc to take notes. We're all going to be creating a Google slideshow or a PowerPoint. Right now, we're going to work on Adobe Spark Video. So everyone is sort of doing the same thing at the same time, but we're integrating those exciting technology resources, but we're not necessarily shifting to provide students with that agency, with that power over their learning to kind of figure out what they specifically need to really accent their own learning and support their own method for learning. So traditional learning with spice is what I think of when I think of tech enriched learning. And again, different from blended learning, because with that, you do have the online portion where they're in control, some face-to-face instruction, but it's not necessarily woven, but more like layered together. Mm-hmm.
So what are those benefits then of transforming that learning environment, getting into that blend, strong use of blended learning?
Well, I mean, this is the really exciting part. And so many of us really have been focused on 21st century skills. And while you definitely can reach 21st century skills, and even the VDOE profile of a Virginia graduate with tech enriched environments, you've got creative thinking, critical thinking, collaboration, communication, citizenship. All those can be woven into your instruction no matter which direction you take. But I really think with blended learning, you can dive deeper into that quality character. And I realize that's not necessarily a characteristic specified in the profile of a Virginia graduate. But with quality character, when you're using blended learning, the students really are able to develop that responsibility to manage their own learning. So when you put that ownership, that power in their hands, then they are able to set their own goals, move forward, reflect on their learning. Did they master something? Get support from the teacher, get support from their peers. But that quality character, and I know that's specific to something that we use in Henrico. But that quality character is still an essential component that students really need to develop. And by giving them agency, that voice, the choice, that is something that I really feel blended learning has the ability to do. And then the teacher is there to provide the support. So instead of always being at the front of the room or just being the voice in the classroom or always the teacher directing exactly what students need to do, the student is able to take control and get support where they need it.
No, I was just going to say, and I love the fact that you mentioned that this idea of the teacher being able to get away from that. What's the saying? I always kind of mess it up. Not the sage on the stage, but the guide on the side, kind of thing. And I know that years ago, when I first looked at blended learning, I had a difficult time with the control aspect of that. Like, oh, but I've got to make sure that we cover these SOLs. I've got to make sure we cover these objectives. I've got to be that, this sage on the stage kind of thing. Well, if you do blended learning well, you have more time to make sure students are covering those kinds of things because you can do those remediation activities. Come on, Brian. And, all those enrichment type things because you're really harnessing the online portion as well. I mean, I love that point. I love that.
Instead of always following the same pace, and this is where I feel a lot of teachers are hesitant or resistant because they think when they're putting that power in the students' hands, they lose all control. But right. Teachers don't. We still have pacing and we still set time frames. And when you're working with the students to develop those goals and helping them understand the time frame that they have, then their pace is within that time frame. So you don't give up all control and you don't throw the pacing guide out the window. You really help the students manage their own time within the time that you have already allotted for this unit or project.
Yeah, moving into this idea around flipped classroom as a way to, one of those entry points, one of those starting places for folks. And that's a term, again, thrown around for a while and people talked about it for a while and now reconsidering it as we look at blended education and enhancing that learning environment. What should folks know about the flipped classroom?
You said it's been around for so long. It really has been around for a very long time. And again, I feel like this is one of those things that teachers sometimes are hesitant to do because it puts so much responsibility in the students or on the students. The instruction or the learning is going to take place outside of the school day. Whereas the guided practice or the projects are what is going to happen face to face. And it sounds as wonderful as it can be. You don't have to be the sage on the stage anymore. The students come in and they're ready to get to work. But really what's important here is that you have to build relationships. And so much in education is built on those relationships, because once you have those relationships, then you can actually individually work with students on goal setting. And you can build a supportive community classroom. And so you might be wondering, what does a supportive community classroom really have to do with the flipped learning? That's because they develop this responsibility to each other. Because if they come in and they're not prepared, they haven't done the pre-work, then they're not going to feel like they are ready. Like the whole community will almost feel I don't want to say disappointed, but there's going to be that responsibility to the classroom that they come in ready to move forward. And that again is why you want to not merge things, but layer them so you're always moving forward. When flipped learning first started years ago, a lot of teachers would send homework home, watch this video, or read this article. But when the students came to class the next day, the teacher went over the same material again. So with the flipped classroom, it's really important to make sure that students are aware that we're not going to cover the same material when you come to class. We are going to move forward with the next thing. So you need to take care of this pre-work. There's that responsibility on the students' hands that they are ready to go to the next thing. Now, also with flipped classrooms, this is your chance to add your voice to students. And you know your students, you've gotten to know them, you know what their interests are, you know where they struggle a little bit, you know what mistakes they're going to be making. So, and the reason I point this out is because you should be the one who is creating these videos. Now, there's no reason you can't provide some extra resources, a playlist, but there is real power in the students hearing your voice when they are learning about this material. So then when they come in and they have questions, when they're referencing part of the video, and it doesn't have to be a video, but if it is, when they're referencing the video, you'll know exactly what they're referring to. And it's a little bit different if you're just giving them a Khan Academy video or a video from any other resource maybe that you just found on YouTube. When you are creating these videos, you are really aware of what you need to say to support your students. Now that feels like you put a lot of pressure on you to create all these videos and all of these things. And I want to tell you that is not what I'm trying to suggest. Doing an entirely flipped classroom takes a long time to develop all these resources. If you have a team, then I highly encourage you to work with your team to create these resources. And that also can help the school community because the students start to realize that, oh, it's not just my teacher who cares about me, but it's also Mr. Carnell, it's also Mr. Dick, it's also Miss Shea, it's also Mr. Sproles. So everybody has a part to play in helping the students, but when they hear your voice or the voices from that school community, then it really helps them know that there are others who care about them.
How do you account for students who are, working full time or have a lot of other obligations outside of school, and balancing that, I guess, is one of the things with flipped.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. Actually, right now I'm currently training for a running event in the fall, and I was reading something and it just really clicked. For me, it's not like when people start to run and train and do things like that, you can't make your life fit into running, you have to make running fit into your life. There we go. And this is going to go back to that goal setting with the students and why it's so important to develop those relationships. Honestly, remember, our kids, they're still developing. They don't have these organizational skills. They have other things they have to do. But the education is so important. When you can meet them where they are and really help them walk through what are their responsibilities, where do they have time? Do they have a few minutes here? Do they have a few minutes there? And maybe a few minutes is making it seem like really small, but you don't want to give students an hour-long video to watch. Remember, this is your lecture and students only have a certain attention time frame that they can really spend watching something. So consider not spending a huge amount of time giving them a video or even something to read. Try to keep it small. And then when you're working with students and really helping them goal set and really helping them think through their life, you can help them understand how to organize their responsibilities to help them become stronger people to develop that quality character. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think there's a lot of agreement and even some research that points to that 6 to 8 minute window for a video. I think that's some of the stuff that YouTube came up with, is that far as that, that time frame. And then I think one of the things too with that, if they're really busy, is to make sure that it is in a format that's mobile, because, even on a break at work, they could take, 5 minutes and watch part of it, and 5 minutes later and watch the rest of it, even on, their mobile device. So that's some of the things to consider. And I'm wondering if people get into learning more about flipped, if there's some kind of affirmation that during this past year, year and a half, that they were actually doing some of those things in the way that they had structured their classes. So, but let's move on to this next one, because we want to talk about a little bit about station rotation as well as a strategy.
So with station rotation, and I feel like many people are familiar with this as well, students are rotating through instructional and application experiences. And generally, when you think of stations, you have all students participating in all stations. Now, there's also the opportunity to provide individual rotation. With individual rotation, you as a teacher would really consider what individual students need and create a more personalized rotation for specific students, just to do at their own pace, if that makes sense. But I'm going to focus on station rotation with the whole classroom. And when you are thinking about station rotation, the first consideration might be whether you yourself as a teacher are going to be part of the station rotations. Like, will you be doing a face-to-face station with students to meet their individual needs? Or do you want to be free to move around the room to offer support and guidance? So that might be one of the first questions that you need to answer about the needs for the stations in your classroom. And then the second thing, when you think about online stations, and I'm not necessarily referring to what we've been doing the past year with virtual learning, but online stations being where they're actually using their devices, completing something maybe that's self-paced or collaborative, but also interactive, because if these are supposed to also help students learn, there needs to be some way for them to get feedback, since you won't be there to give it to them. So offering interactive activities that can tell them if they're right or wrong to help them continue to learn is going to be an essential component of these online stations. And then for offline stations, like having different types of stations available, make sure that you've got some real world application that they can do. And these also can be collaborative or independent. But so like I said, the first thing you want to consider is, will you be available to help, or will you have that face-to-face station? What will be your online stations? What might be your offline stations that they will rotate through as they go? And Caitlin Tucker actually has an amazing resource that talks about how to, actually gives some ideas for different types of online stations and offline stations, but also just thinking about how to organize and plan for each station as well.
Great. And those are leading us towards some of the changes that teachers would have to make in like maybe their planning process. So what are some of the changes that happen as you begin to grow from being aware to really becoming active to really implementing blended learning?
When you think about these, I mean, the first thing that you want to consider is that relationship and goal setting. At the beginning of your class, you really want to set up the goals for the day to make sure students understand what their objectives are and what their options are for meeting those goals. If you're specifically doing a flipped classroom, it's going to be important to help the students understand why the pre-work, why that flipped portion is going to be essential for the next day's activity. Again, if they have no idea, there's no buy-in, there's no understanding, then the priority for completing those things is going to be a lot lower. Remember to keep it short if you are doing flipped, whether it's items that you create or even different articles. The length of time you can use, there are some online tools to help you understand the length of time it would take to read an article. So make sure that you're considering how much time your students have outside of school to complete your activities as well. And remember to keep it moving forward. When you look at your lesson plan and you've got the different activities planned out, are they repeating a lot of the same information, or are you really moving the learning forward for all of the different activities you're planning? Um, Clear directions are essential, and this goes without saying for any kind of instruction, especially when you think about the station rotation. If you are going to be in a station working face to face with students, then making sure that students understand the other stations that they're rotating through, making sure they have those clear directions there is going to make sure that you are freed up to work with students when they come to your station. And something else you might want to consider is doing the mastery based exit tickets, and not just an exit ticket of, can you do this or did you find these three things, but really looking at the skills that they were in, supposed to learn that day and practice through the flipped or the stations, and did they really master those activities.
Looking at that flip, looking at station rotation, how you might change as you implement blended learning. Certainly you mentioned some of the ideas for teacher entry points, but you also touched on some of the things about how, what are the student entry points? What are the things that you have to do? And I think it was mentioned in the chat about front loading for students, what those things are that they're expected to do, those clear expectations, along with, as you mentioned, clear directions. And then as part of that, just systematically going through that, cycling through that, the feedback for your students and from your students, I think, on how things are going. And then you also mentioned, a consideration of that mastery path approach to how things would move in your classroom. Again, pointing back to that student agency and that, path and pace again towards that mastery effort. So those are all great considerations. I think your next slide has a bunch of resources on it.
It does. It does. So I put these together, and so now people might be wondering, well, how do I get them? But there are a lot of resources on here. The article that I mentioned from Caitlin Tucker is that 6th one down. Need inspiration designing station rotation lessons. So that's the Caitlin Tucker. I highly recommend all of these. But if you're looking specifically for that resource, it's right there. If you would like to, so on the next slide, I actually added a like tiny.cc entry points. This is the link actually to my conversation points. So feel free to hop on there and you can have all of my thoughts on our topic here and all the links to the resources as well.
Thank you again, Anne, for your time and expertise today and the resources that you've pulled together for us here and shared out.